pleasure for me to be here today, and I want to thank very much the organising committee, Joseph, Heidi and Sue for that lovely introduction, and also to Barbara Locke, also another co-chair. It's such an amazing, I don't think I've ever been to such a multicultural conference. Isn't that amazing? 30 years of academia, and it's just, I was looking at the list of where all of you are from the brochure, and I just think just about every country in the world is represented. So it's indeed a privilege to talk to you about my work. And I think the title of this conference is what really attracted me. Transforming and changing education. What is education for if it isn't about transforming and changing? And also about the idea of borderlands. And through the borderlands, we become and we know, and we can belong or not. And this idea of borderlands, I think, is really important in trying to understand our complex knowledge economies. When I looked at the papers, I didn't have much to do last night, as you can tell, after the football, but I was really intrigued that the places, these borderlands, take place in the classroom, primary education, secondary education, some of you are involved in. Then there's higher education and tertiary education. So many different places of teaching and learning, these new borderlands. And then you're working through it in different ways. New technology, curriculum reform and change, engaging students in different ways. And then, I think the biggest group of you are working with language. And it was interesting that we had a question this morning about language and difference, and students who come from abroad. And we also are looking at pedagogic practice within all of those different forums. But what I do notice about the studies that we do in education, and I'm also been at the Institute of Education, I'm now emeritus professor there, I know I don't look it, thank you very much, but the idea of identities, who we are as professionals, is far less something that we tend to reflect on. We look at who we teach and what we teach, but not who we are. And so my purpose today is to unpack some of those reflexive, ethical kind of concerns in what we do, and look at the affective, and this is I'm now in a sociology department, I've moved from an educational department, in the university to the sociology department, and the word, all the rage at the moment, is affect, the feeling, the emotions that are embodied in our institutions, and how the social world works through fear of others or certain kinds of feelings that we have. So what are the feelings in our learning landscapes? And how is power and privilege and inequality produced through those feelings, through this affect? I want to look at three things. Firstly, how is race, class, and gender lived in the realities of our universities, in our places of higher learning? What is this affective positioning? Elspeth Probyn, who is an Australian academic, as many of you probably know, talks about affective eduscapes that we now have, as Penny was describing, in borderless universities, what they call edgeless institutions, global, huge global institutions, these desiring machines where we consume students and we embody their being. But yet, we are still very traditional and privileged. In fact, here in Britain, and I'm sure this is a case, I was reading Louise Morland's work on Tanzania and Ghana, was her other place of research, that what's happening, even though higher education is expanding, privilege and gaps remain entrenched. And I think this is really an interesting tension. Expansion and yet privilege. How is that happening? And how are we allowing that to happen? So the second question is, how do we as professionals and students and researchers navigate these systems, these monolithic systems? How do we find cracks in the systems for our pedagogies in times of rapid social change? And thirdly, what are our pedagogies of resistance? What are our other ways of knowing in our institutions? And how does that sustain us in our hard and difficult work? I think education is truly on the chalk face of where things happen. And yet, it wears you down, doesn't it? And we have to find the fire in our bellies and find what makes us resist, change, and transform. I went to a conference recently where everyone was saying, we had these discussion groups and we're going, it's so terrible, we have to work so hard, there's so much bureaucracy, the hours are so long. We just don't have time to engage in the transformative pedagogy. It's all right talking about it. And some of the older ones in the group were saying, what happened to the fire in our bellies? You know, from the 60s and 70s, where has it gone? We are like machines in our institutions. We are good people, always doing as we're told. Well, today, let's think about some strategies to disrupt and be a bit naughty. As Sue very kindly introduced me, I mentioned my work around Black British feminism, and it's something that I've been working on for 30 years. It sounds like a very long time, but it's a passion of mine. I'm from the Caribbean, in Trinidad, and I came to Britain in the 70s, and I experienced what it was to be othered. And that kind of raised my consciousness. And the notion of black in Britain is about the post-colonial others who occupy the space of difference. In the USA, it is very much an African-American intonation when you talk about black feminism. But here, it's about that shared experience of the post-colonial liberators from Africa and India when they came to Britain. They created unity. And that is what Black British feminism is about, looking at that unity. It also places the body at the center of the analysis, the female body, and the way that difference plays out for her. It looks at the way that difference becomes organized, her difference becomes organized into systematic social and political structures and practices in particular historical moments. So it isn't that, ideas of race are the same forever. They manifest themselves differently in different historical times. And we are in a very particular time at the moment where we talk about post-raceness. Have you heard this notion of post-race? That somehow we have moved beyond the idea that there is discrimination because we're all free-floating neoliberal individuals. We've got choice. We can move. We can travel. We can access opportunities once we might have a wider participation scheme to allow us in. So therefore, with people such as Obama or big middle classes of large ethnic minority groups in Western countries, but even in India and China and Africa, that we can no longer talk about race as being something that is oppressive and stops opportunities. So we also talk about post-feminist world, where now we have the feminization of higher education, that somehow gender is not an issue in higher education. But we know where the privilege lies, because even if there are opportunities for women, where are they in the hierarchies? So we have to look at the patterns of where women are in higher education, and it is not a level playing field. So have you heard of Heidi Safia? She's a post-colonial critic and a woman of colour, and she says that as a black or post-colonial feminist, we always simply have to ask the question, what does this mean? What do the changes in higher education mean? What does the proclamation that we are now post-race and post-feminist mean? And then begin to plot a history to try and reveal our truth about social reality. And I want to begin with the story of Cornelia Sarabji. And Cornelia Sarabji came from India, and she was the first woman to study law in a British university. And she was one of the first women, actually, to be in a British university in the 1880s. And the reason, I think I kind of adopted her as my mentor. Maybe she's a mentor who can't speak back. So that's why I admire her, and her struggle is one that kind of mirrors my own. But Cornelia studied law in Oxford, and she was seen as an exotic other. She was hailed as a unique, one in a million individual. She was talked about as wearing wonderful saris, and she was dined by Balfour and Florence Nightingale and Gladstone. She was regaled in the highest places. And she talks about wanting to go to the library, and in those days, of course, women weren't even allowed into universities. And she says, men would rush and give up a seat for her. They wouldn't for the other women, because she was different. And this is the interesting story about difference. It's about difference, but what kind of difference does difference make? So, Chandra Mohanty, who's written a very famous piece of work which you've probably heard of called Under Western Eyes, she says that, we can acknowledge difference, but what kind of difference is acknowledged? And as Foucault says, sometimes the colonizer and the colonized, sometimes they know you better than you know yourself. And these has huge implications for your own well-being in institutions. And what I learned about Cornelia Sarabji is that it's impossible to escape the body. She wasn't seen as an intellect in her own right. She was seen as an Indian woman who was a curiosity. And what is interesting is she died many years later in the 1950s in an asylum. And this kind of, I suppose, upsets me, because it's about the way in which there is such a weight of whiteness in the institution which she had to navigate. She was an outsider within an institution. And in Black feminism, we also often talk about what it is to be the outsider within. And here, one of my Black feminist colleagues in the book Blackish Feminism writes, I think this very interesting and poignant thing, which she uses the work of Bourdieu, and she says, the world I inhabit as an academic is a white world. I'm fresh water that swims in seawater. I feel the weight of the water on my body. She's summing up what it's like to be different, to feel the weight of the water. So it's like you're a freshwater fish in seawater. You can't quite breathe, but you can't put your finger on it. It's about that weight on your body. And this sedimented whiteness, these places of power and privilege, is in the institutional fabric of our institutions. It isn't just in British universities, but it's in the way our universities work globally, because we, as Joseph was saying, have exported our universities and our ways of thinking and being and privilege to other places. And so even though it might not be populated by white people, the idea of privilege is still there in that same way. I suppose I'm very much involved in this thinking, because in the UK there are only 17 Black women professors. Can out of 85 black professors. And so I'm one of those 17. Sometimes if we have a conference and there's 10 of us on a plane, we say better not crash, because the whole of our intellectual endeavor would go down. So, you know, it's really interesting that we are so few. So, I want to take that story of what it means to live within these institutions and look at some of the research that I've done recently. I've been involved in a very large ESRC project, 45 million ESRC project, called Understanding Society, which is about mapping the changes in British society. It's called the Household Panel Survey. And what was really interesting, in order for us to set up the questions that we're going to ask the 100,000 families that in the ethnic strand of the survey, we had to do some cognitive testing. And we did some really in-depth interviews with students and researchers in higher education to look at the way in which they might construct or experience their ethnicity. And the piece of research that I did looked at women from India, Turkey, and Pakistan, who live in Canada, UK, and Europe, Holland in particular. And it was really interesting to see the way in which they were constructed in this way of being known better than you know yourself. And here, Latamani, another post-colonial academic, says, the disjunctures are always there between how I see myself and the kind of knowledge about me that I keep bumping into in the West. And this opens up new questions for social and political inquiry. So how you see yourself and how you are seen is two different things. And Frantz Fanon, another post-colonial, very powerful writer, says, we have to see how our bodies are sealed into the crushing objecthood of the skin. He calls it the epidermalization of racism. How the crushing objectification of you through the skin, through your phenotype, how you look, how you're seen, how you're judged, even before you go into the room, even by your name. He has a wonderful piece where he says, you know, he was a doctor, an eminent doctor, and he was walking through the streets of Paris in the 50s. And he says, you know, a little boy points him out and says, Mummy, Mummy, look, there's a nigger. Uses that word. And he says, at that moment, I heard tom-toms beating. I saw Tarzan coming through the trees. Because all my years of scholarship didn't matter. That's how I was constructed. I think that's such a powerful piece, and I urge you to read that. So our bodies carry unequal value depending on space and place and time and history where we are. And here, one of the researchers that we talked to, Meranissa from India, she says she was going for an interview for a job in Britain. And she says, you can see your skin and physical characteristics, the dressing, the physical appearance. So when she goes for an interview, she says, they say, this girl is a nation. So that character, physical appearance, my skin will affect others. Discrimination always comes from the other side. I think that's a really powerful statement that she says, that you are reduced to a nation, not an individual. She's no longer an I, she's the we of the nation. She carries that burden. And that answers some of your question this morning. International students carry that weight on their body. And a colleague of mine at Goldsmiths, Nirmal Puwar, she talks about social spaces not being open for just anyone to occupy. social spaces have sedimented meaning, and that meaning is sedimented over time. So some bodies can naturally inhabit those spaces and no one will ask a question. And others are seen as trespassers. And she calls them space invaders, that somehow you're invading that space. And that you have to be, as Penny was saying this morning, you have to be contained and you have to be known in order for that containment to happen. And Sarah Armid, we're also working at Goldsmiths. We're all there at Goldsmiths. Again, I think we're all Goldsmiths because we all gone. Another black feminist. She says that we can be different, but not too different in a multicultural society. Because if you reject the embrace of the host, if you don't show gratitude for them embracing and welcoming you into that society, then you are rejecting. And I know what this feels like, if you don't drink alcohol, for example, and somebody says, no, you must drink, you must have a drink, and you go, no, they take offense. And that can happen so easily. And she's talking about this difference, but you can't be too different. And she uses the case, for example, of the hijab, of wearing the veil, as particularly of wearing the niqab, the full face veil, that is seen as a total rejection of the society which has offered you the embrace, the assimilation. And so this idea of difference means, yes, you can, like Cornelia, be different, but not too different. And Patricia Hill Collins, another black feminist, talks about the politics of containment. How when we had apartheid, or when we had Jim Crow, and we had, physical divisions between people, and in India you might have a caste system, physical divides between people. Here, now, when you're allowed inside places of privilege, you have to be watched, looked at, and make sure that you remain unraced and undifferent, non-threatening. You have to be just like the others, not too different. Sometimes I wonder, how I became a professor in such a white place. And I spent a lot of time learning the game and being nice. It was really hard, and sometimes I'd go home and cry. I'd have to go home and eat my own food and nourish myself with my own friends, and then put on my armor and go back out into the institutions from where I was, because you are constantly worn down by that feeling. I'm going to tell you about another piece of research which I've recently done, looking at teacher educators and looking at the pedagogy of the tutors that train the teachers. I don't like to use the term train, but that's what tends to be happening now, but are educating the teachers. And in Britain, of course, 97% of those tutors are white, and nearly all their students in places like the Institute of Education, about 63% of them would be white, but about 30% are from overseas. So you have white middle class tutors training, educating educators who are going to work in tough, multicultural inner city schools with very little understanding of race and difference. We don't have any obligation to teach about diversity in our teacher training courses here in Britain. Just a 2-hour slot, and usually I'm the one who's wheeled in to do it. So I find that a really interesting, it's not mandatory. Some courses do give good training, but that's only if they have staff that feel comfortable to do that. But in this example I want to talk about, it's about the way that discourses of securitization that are now sweeping up everything in higher education. We've got prevent strategies to monitor Muslim students. We're being asked to report any unusual activity amongst our children in primary schools. Islamophobia in the West has made it legitimate to be racist. It's the new battlefield, and somehow, because it's couched in terms of securitization, we do not have to feel that it is a racist space, because it's about our safety. So you all have to charge up your mobile phones before you travel back. And we're going to do it, because it's for our safety, no matter how ridiculous it is, we will have to do it. This example about gendered religious racism is from a tutor who is his placement student is a young Muslim woman. And he said to us, Muslim women make poor teachers. They are too passive and acquiescent to teach effectively. The tutor insisted this was an accurate assessment of all Muslim students. He'd only ever met one, but it was true of all Muslim students. And he admitted that he was harder on Kalila, the student, for this reason. So what does this tell us about how racism is lived out? And gendered religious racism, this intersectionality between all of those aspects of her life. It shows us how race, faith, and gender is lived on and through the body. How her overdetermined dress has given people the legitimate right to comment and judge her. There is no respect for her own piety or reasons to wear the veil. She's seen as a kind of construction of the barbaric other. Oh, look how uncivilized those people are. Look how they treat their women. It gives legitimacy to Islamophobia. What is really interesting in this case as well is she's seen as the victim in need of saving. We have to save the Muslim women somehow. We have huge projects. I mean, we even have ads on the tube now. There's one that says, this is the worst period of her life, meaning that the woman is having the period, and we now have to donate money, or we have to donate money for female genital mutilation. We need to raise money for women in Afghanistan, for education. Now, these are all important things, but why, and this is the thing that Gayatri Spivak says, we need to plot the history. Why now? Why is it manifesting itself? Since when have we been so interested in Muslim women's bodily parts, should I say? And I find it quite upsetting to sit there and see the gaze of the other, all these people in the tube reading The Sun and all sorts of things, and there's a picture of a woman, calling for FGM. I feel very upset by that, because this is the objectification of the Muslim woman other, of the victim of Islamophobia. What is really interesting about this as well, this case, is that she's seen as weak and acquiescent, and so he takes it upon himself to teach her a lesson. He's going to be hard on her. He's going to make it better by teaching her a lesson. And I think that that's just an incredible way in which racism subtly plays out. 5 minutes? So I just want to raise the issue in the last few minutes of how do we decolonize ourselves? Because as I was saying earlier, we're far less likely to look at ourselves and our practices. We're very busy looking at that of our students and what we teach and do. But language is a site of contestation. And here, Fatma, who's Turkish, and she speaks 3 languages fluently. I so admire her. She says, English is a language where I can express my universal identity. And she says it shapes her identity. She can speak English, she expresses one identity, and it gives her a refreshed feeling. She feels empowered by English. And I think this is very interesting, and I call her like a transnational chameleon. my work, always shapeshifters. They change all the time in these new transnational identities that educationalists have. She moves in and out of different languages. And what is interesting about English, she sees it as liberating. And yet, as Frantz Fanon was saying, we have to decolonize our minds because English is the language of the colonizer. We think in those ways, the ways in which that language allows it. It's part of the Western imperial project to know us. So we have taken on the mantle of the colonizer. And yet, what Amina Mama is saying is that we do not simply have to accept these images or these ideas of ourselves, but use our collective histories, if you like, to regain power within our oppressive social orders and to counteract racism and sexism that we experience. So we can play with language, but we need to understand the roots of power within language. And what happens with these transnational comedians is that they cross over to the other side of the tracks, and this is again partly what I'm saying about my own experience. We move, we change, we might start off as working class, we go into our institutions, we leave our families behind. It's really hard to go back, and those are painful places to be. When we cross over the other side of the tracks, what we need to do is keep alive, and we found this really integral in our research, that people talked about their roots, their ancestors, their memories, and the psychic landscapes. They talked about the smell of cut grass in the mountains in Turkey, or the smell of food as ways of sustaining who they are. Where do we stand as educators? We need to decolonize our pedagogy. So we need to think about, what do we mean by equality? It's a troubled notion. We talk a lot about wanting equality, but it's a liberal democratic idea of fair play, having a level playing field. But how do we create those level playing fields? Secondly, what are our principles of professional and academic engagement, and how do we arrive at them? One of my favourite books is Helen Casey's I Answer With My Life. It's a very old book, but I find it very powerful. She looks at the experiences of nuns, African American teachers in urban situations, Jewish educators, and she looks at the way in which they build reciprocal relationships, where language becomes the site of action, and they change through love. She says the power of love can change our lives. And finally, what social and political cultural change do we want to achieve? This is a very big question. And Paulo Freire talks about the consciousization of new intellectuals, that actually you aren't born a conscious, radical intellectual, but you become that through struggle. And I think that that's really important, because when we want change, that means that people are going to be equal. How do we deal with the demands that people are going to make? This morning I turned on the TV and there's a massive strike of the teachers this morning here in the UK. We want equality. The government says they want equality. But are they prepared for what it means? I just want to end with the same picture as Heidi of Paulo Freire. Sisters, but a different quote. And Paulo Freire here is talking about liberatory education, and he's talking about the fact that the more radical a person is, the more fully you enter into knowing who you are and how to transform it. And he says that this individual, this radical individual that you can become, is not afraid to confront, listen, and see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet people or enter into dialogue with them, true dialogue with them. and this person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor or the knower of knowledge of history, or the liberator of the oppressed. You're not going in there to liberate anyone. But from your commitment within history, you fight by their side. And I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you very much.